This is a remarkable time and a remarkable part of the world in the Middle East, so we're really lucky to have these two speakers join us. As you all know, Abbas Malani, he has been a frequent guest here at the World Affairs Council. What I just learned tonight, though, is about two of his courses at Stanford. One of them is about domestic politics in Iran, and I would love to take that course. But the even more interesting one is on the aesthetics of dissent in Iran. So I'm going to be signing off if you take people of my lesser quality and knowledge. But everybody knows that Abbas has been, he's co-director of the Iran Democracy Project at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He's a professor, been professor and department chair as well there. But I think what's interesting is that he was on the board of directors at Tehran University's Center for International Studies back at a very different time. Janine Zakaria, you all know from watching her on television, you all know from having read her work in the Washington Post and Bloomberg News, but we're now lucky enough to have her in this part of the country, lecturing at Stanford, lecturing in journalism, both at the graduate and undergraduate level. And so we'll probably, she goes back and forth to the region a lot, so we will get a very fresh take from her. So please join me in welcoming both Janine and Abbas. Now, I think we've all been kind of riveted on news coming from Lausanne or not coming from Lausanne on the Iran nuclear talks, but at the same time, what we're seeing is a proxy war taking place right next door. In Yemen, a proxy war between Iran on the one hand, supporting insurgents, and the Saudis and other regional allies on the other hand, supporting the now ousted president. Talk a bit, Abbas, about, what are the chances of this being, I guess, referred to a hot war, a war that is less of a proxy war and more direct?
Well, first of all, in a sense, there are three proxy wars, one in Yemen, one in Iraq, and one in Syria, where Iran and the United States, Iran and Saudi Arabia are on opposite sides of a very, very lethal war. So if you look at it in that sense, it is already a hot war, and it is already a very complicating aspect to, I think, what is going on in Switzerland. One of the reasons that it's difficult to arrive at a lasting resolution is because everybody knows that unless you have some purchase on solving these things, regardless of what paper you sign in Lausanne, there are going to be these clouds that shadow and potentially overwhelm everybody.
So we've heard about Israel's opposition to an Iran deal, but there are also other regional allies that are very anxious about that deal, including the Saudis and others. Are they anxious about that deal because they're concerned about what will be the actual content of that agreement, or are they much more concerned that an Iran unconstrained by sanctions might be even more mischievous in the region?
I think they're concerned for both of those reasons. They're concerned that if U.S. relations with Iran are normalized, Iran will feel under less pressure. And if Iran feels under less pressure, it might become even a more ambitious and assertive player in the region. They're also, I think, worried that if Iran does, in fact, get the breakout capacity for a nuclear program, and in my view, they already have it. I think it's semantic. I think they really have everything except the last piece of the puzzle to become a weaponized state, because they know how to enrich uranium. They have 19,000 centrifuges ready to go. They have 6,000 of them churning. They know how to make these centrifuges. They're building a missiles program, so I don't know what else other than the last piece of the puzzle, that is weaponizing this enriched uranium, they need to be a breakout.
This is what they've been able to achieve without an agreement and with sanctions. Do you, in your own view, is your view that we're better off with or without a deal?
I think we are better off with a deal, but depending on the details of the deal, because I think in the long run, and I've believed this many times, and I've talked about it here with you, I believe the only solution to Iran's nuclear program and the only solution to Iran's shenanigans in the region is if Iran has a more democratic, more responsible government, not one exported by Washington, but a kind of a democratic process that is ingrown and grows out of what are truly, in my view, strong indigenous forces that want a different Iran, not necessarily a republic a la the French model, but a republic that is based on the desires of the Iranian people and not the visions of millenarian clerics who think of themselves as the new liberators of the region.
So if that were one's agenda, if one's goal was to achieve that, what would be the effect of failing to come to agreement with the Rouhani government, with a negotiator like Zarif? In other words, with folks who seem more inclined to reach out to the rest of the world than Ahmadinejad was, for example.
My sense is that if there is a failure to achieve a nuclear agreement, what you will have is a further radicalization of Iran. There are many people in Iran who are as worried about the deal as the 47 remarkable senators who wrote that truly shocking letter at the time. So there are people like the Republican senators in Iran who are as interested in torpedoing this process. Mm-hmm. And the loser, the real loser in my mind, if there is no deal, is the possibility of a gradual transition towards a more responsible government in Iran.
Mm-hmm. So Janine, let me take you to the politics in Israel of the Iran negotiations and of Netanyahu's very clear opposition to an agreement.
Mm-hmm. Wolf Blitzer and American senators were talking more about Iran's nuclear program during the Israeli election than they were in Israel. It really wasn't a top issue. In fact, there were very few issues at all that were discussed during the Israeli election campaign. It was a campaign that was caught up in personalities, in snarky videos that went viral for anybody that was able to watch them. And Prime Minister Netanyahu's primary election campaign strategy was just to say one clear message: I am the only leader who can protect your children, literally, by putting out campaign ads that portrayed him as the, quote, babysitter, the babysitter, where he was babysitting people's kids while they went out for dinner. And it was not by accident that he avoided any substantive issues like the Palestinian question or anything else. He really just wanted to keep it focused on his personality. However, when it came to that doesn't mean, though, that he is not genuinely concerned about Iran. In fact, when I've spoken to him, this is really his raison d'etre of building this international coalition of sanctions on Iran. He feels this is because of him, and in large part it has been. And so he's watching that consensus dissolve before his eyes, and he really has no other geopolitical card. I mean, he's not doing the Palestinian issue, not really domestically. He's not interested in the issues that the Israeli electorate are interested in, like the price of housing. He pays lip service to it. So in that context, and as he was trailing in the polls, he decided to come to Washington to give that pretty unprecedented speech, I would think, in terms of... Now, it's not the first time that, by any means, that an Israeli leader has butt heads with an American president over a significant foreign policy issue, of course. And I was reading, in preparation for this, I was going back and looking at the AWACS sale to Saudi Arabia in 1981, and Ronald Reagan was considered a pretty pro-Israel president, and especially in retrospect. And at the time he said of Begin, the Israeli prime minister at the time, boy, that guy makes it hard for you to be his friend. And, you know, it's so interesting. I encourage you to go back and look at that period because there were so many parallels. Begin went to Congress at that time, as an aside, and went to senators and found people who were his point and lobbied against the sale, infuriating the White House. But he didn't give up there. He didn't get up there and give a speech like a presidential address the way Bibi did. So in that sense, it was quite different.
It's the public confrontation, the public humiliation, public effort to
it was much,
isolate.
Right. There were these kinds of comments, but it wasn't out in the public the way that President Obama and Netanyahu have fought over this. So I think the consequence of that speech, we don't really know how it translated politically back. I mean, he won, obviously, so maybe it was part of the reason that he won. I am not 100% certain that Israelis, because there was a downside to, there was a risk involved too by picking a fight with your only true friend, the U.S. On the world stage, your only reliable ally, the United States. So, but he calculated that it would be worth the risk.
Yeah. Well, and what was the cost here domestically? If you think about it, I suspect that Hillary Clinton, who has been very supportive of Israel when she was a senator from New York, would likely distance herself from any, from this spat and show her support for Israel. And certainly the Republican Party seems to be making clear that that is, a basic tenet of the party. In the end, will Bibi Netanyahu be right? Will he succeed in isolating Obama on his own soil, or will there be a price to pay?
Well, I think there already is a price, and it's something that's going to play out more and more over time. But Netanyahu made it really difficult for Democrats, really difficult. And one thing that Israel needs, if it wants to survive long term, is it needs bipartisan support in the United States for a wide range of agendas, including arms sales and all of these things. And he put Democrats who are pro-Israel themselves in a position where they had to choose between the president and Netanyahu. And that's why you had that interesting statement, comment from Nancy Pelosi saying, talking about how she was crying during the speech, because she felt like, why is he telling me I'm not pro? Why is he suggesting that only John Boehner and Mitch McConnell and these kinds of people are pro-Israel? I love Israel too. These are not a lot of Democrats who have supported Israel over the years. So I think that was a dangerous game. But he's doubling down. He's doubling down, welcoming Republican leaders to Israel right now, today. Senator McConnell, we were just talking in the green room back there about standing next to Bibi as Prime Minister Netanyahu as he's condemning the talk, saying this is a disaster, basically, and Mitch McConnell saying, not Mitch McConnell, Senator McConnell saying, we're with you, Netanyahu. I mean, to have that kind of lobbying against the president right now is, I don't know, Abbas, do you remember something like this? I mean, this blatant?
I never remember ever the head of another state being invited to the joint session of the U.S. Congress at the time where the United States was engaged in probably one of the most important, crucial, strategic negotiations in its 3-4 decades that I've been following. And for that head of a state to then come and embarrass the President of the United States, I have never seen it. I have never heard the Congress of the United States act in this way. And I think there is a price to be paid. I think the price in the long run is that it's going to make it much, much more difficult to arrive at a consensus, even amongst American Israeli supporters, American Jews in support of Israel. I don't think I have ever seen, and you would know this much better, I have never seen the American Jewish community as tormented about defending Israel as they do now. And there's some very, very troubling trend lines on the horizon, not just in terms of demographics in Israel, but in terms of the demographics here. What percentage of American Jewish families are willing to send their children back to Israel to get their year of experience there? I mean, the trend towards a cultural Jew that is not necessarily supportive of everything that Israel does should be a source of worry, I think, to anyone who's thinking.
In that sense, we're becoming more like Israel, because the Israeli Jews are not sitting there saying, Netanyahu right or wrong, or any particular leader right or wrong. You certainly have a much more, you have a robust democracy where there's debate over the wisdom of steps of the prime minister.
And look, I mean, the American Jewish community, anybody who's been around these discussions, they're going to bicker about it, and people are going to be either very hawkish pro Netanyahu's viewpoints on these things, that Israel is surrounded by foes, the whole world is against Israel, we need to support whatever that Prime Minister Netanyahu says unconditionally, and there are other people who are going to see steps that Israel is taking as conflicting with their values as progressive Democrats, and that's going to play out. To me, that's not the relevant question right now. The more relevant question is, what are regular non-Jewish Americans looking at this going to say? And how supportive are they going to be? For example, the next time you have a Gaza flare-up, And you've got, for example, a whole bunch of weaponry that the U.S. stores in the region in Israel, as just stockpiles it there as a safe harbor. And the prime minister, Israel's in a war, and they're bombing Gazans, and they call up the Pentagon like they just did last summer and say, we need to borrow that, we need this stuff. Is that going to fly in the future? Are people going to go for this? How is long-term American support for Israel going to play out when you have these kinds of short-term tactical moves by Netanyahu, and he's not going away anytime soon?
So in many ways, we've been focused on what he's said about the Iran negotiations, but in many ways, the more troubling is his, at the very end of the campaign, him saying that there wouldn't be a two-state solution on his watch. President Obama has said, well, then it would be feckless for us to be continuing to try. You know, we should put this on hold and wait until there's greater openness. Do you think President Obama is saying that because he really would put the talks on hold? Is he fed up and giving up, or is that maybe a canny move to try to get Prime Minister Netanyahu back on the record, in support of a two-state solution? What do you think's happening there?
My sense was that he was truly troubled by what Netanyahu said, and I think he believes, as I suspect most leaders of the international community believe, as many in Israel believe, as virtually everyone the left of the center and the center in Israel believes, that the only long-term solution, the only long-term security solution for Israel is a two-state solution. You can't have millions of people in this state, in the current state, and think that this is going to survive. And what Obama said, I think, brought pressure on Bibi, and he had to sort of try to backstep and said, that's not what I really meant. And if there is a possibility, if there is a negotiator on the other side, we will negotiate. So I think there are the Reagan years. There is the time where Baker went to the Congress and said, gave his phone number and said, if Israelis want to contact me, this is my phone number, they should contact me. There are those moments, but this level of public feuding and, again, the trend lines in the public opinion, I mean, over 60%, I think, now of the U.S. Population favors a negotiated solution to Iran's nuclear program. That has to be worrying Netanyahu, who thinks that the deal is a bad deal, and he thinks it's a bad deal for not just Israel. I mean, if you put yourself in Netanyahu's position, and I think you're absolutely right, he does feel threatened. And he's right to feel threatened, because there are idiots in Iran who on a regular daily basis threaten Israel, put pictures of missiles on websites, put them on the border of Israel and say, this next one is coming to Tel Aviv. So if you're sitting in Israel, you have to be worried when you have idiots like that for foes. But the solution isn't to take a public feud with the President of the United States, nor is the solution to make an argument that I don't think has no buyers outside Netanyahu himself, which is all enrichment has to stop in Iran in order for a deal to be a good deal. That is a non-starter. Iran is not going to start it. Nobody in the international community, except, again, Israel, seems to be for it. Look at Russia. The remarkable thing is Russia is now picking fights with the United States, is looking for occasions to embarrass the United States and stand up to the United States. Russia has essentially stood with the 5+1 on Iran till today.
The PERM 5+1 that are the negotiators, on our side.
Yeah, I just want to make a point on what Abbas said quite rightly, and it's not that Netanyahu doesn't have legitimate concerns about the nuclear program, and the same concerns in this odd alliance that we referred to earlier that the Saudis have and the UAE have and a lot of other players in the region have beyond Mitch McConnell and John Boehner. But the question is, why can't they talk about this properly, diplomatically, quietly, behind closed doors? Why can't they get that done? And this is how it sort of relates to the Palestinian question, because that's why you have to go back to where everything's kind of personal here in some level. It's not only about centrifuges and hidden facilities and what's the level of inspections going to be, and how are we going to have the breakout time and all these things you hear in the news. Relations between Netanyahu and Obama soured from the very beginning, from 2009 when Obama appointed George Mitchell as the negotiator, and they were pushing for a full settlement freeze, not only outside the blocks of settlements and all these things. And it got progressively more contentious with the president, when the president went to the region and went to Egypt and skipped Israel. I mean, there were all these things building that made it, so, when the president came out and said, we should have a two-state solution based on the 67 borders. Netanyahu went ballistic, lectured him in the Oval Office, as a reminder to all of you, about why that, what that means. So all of these things were happening. So I think Obama was just, on the one hand, just really not in the mood to have Netanyahu be a part of these. He didn't really want him there. Second, when the Israelis were leaking everything, they had to shut him out. So this infuriated Netanyahu and made it so he had to find out by spying, as the Wall Street Journal reported, on Iranians, what was actually happening in the talks. But all that said, I think Netanyahu's acting a little bit like a desperate man right now. He's really is worried because the original goal was to make sure in a completely verifiable way, correct me if I'm wrong, Abbas, that unequivocally that Iran's nuclear program was going to be peaceful. And the way they were going to do that was only allowing research reactors, spent fuel was going to go out of the country, they were going to bring fuel from international fuel banks for if they needed power and things like that. Now they've given up on this because of what you said quite strikingly. They already know how to do the bomb and they're going to insist on enrichment anyway. And so now it's a matter of, well, how long is it going to take for them to get the bomb? We're acknowledging they're going to keep enrichment. Iran has won a huge victory, whether they get a deal by the 30th or not. And so this is sending tremors through Jerusalem. They're just not happy about it. But just to point a note, on MSNBC just the other day, Bibi said, you know what, we could live with some centrifuges, us and the Arab states, but maybe not as many as they're saying, but we could live with it if we had to. So he did mollify himself.
They go from 22,000 to 6,000. What is the number of centrifuges that are being talked about?
What he wants is symbolic centrifuges.
What is being talked about in Lausanne?
On what we think
really know
and what has been leaked probably by people who are listening to these conversations, because it's supposed to be confidential. But the good guess is that it's about 6,000 centrifuges are going to be working. They're going to be doing 5%, 3 to 5% enrichment. Iran either will send out all of its 20% enriched uranium or will change its composition in a way that it will be very, very difficult.
In a verifiable way.
In a verifiable way. It will be very, very intrusive system. There's also the Iraq reactor.
There'd be a lot less close to nuclear weapons than they can get without a deal. In essence, I mean, if they stayed with all their centrifuges spinning and no inspections.
If you read what the 5+1 is saying and what the Obama administration is saying, is that we have basically now accepted that these guys can have a breakout capacity if they want to. We just want to prolong the distance between the time 1 that they decide to break out to time 2 where they can have the bomb. Yeah. They want this time 1, time 2 be at least 1 year so that the international community can find out and do something about it. But in reality, it's going to be very hard, first of all, to find out if these guys want to cheat. They have shown that they can cheat very effectively. They set up a whole fardu. It took the international community a couple of years to find out that they were building something in the mountain. I mean, I don't know what the satellites were doing all this time. It's very difficult to miss something like this. They built the whole Natanz, the size of 3 football fields, underground in the city, fortified. They virtually took all of the cement out of the country. For a while, there was no cement in Iran. And the international community, the intelligence community, didn't seem to know that these guys were building these things there. So that, again, is what worries Netanyahu.
So let's stick with the placement of some of these, basically of both the centrifuges and of materials. There's a lot of talk out there about, well, if you don't get a deal, what about a military solution? What about airstrikes against the nuclear program? You know, much like the Israeli strikes in I guess, the Iraqi nuclear program back in '82. how feasible is that? I mean, literally, just logistically, how feasible is it? Because the program's pretty widely dispersed, and politically, how feasible is it?
Well, first of all, there is no comparison between Iraq's nuclear program or Syria's nuclear program and or Libya's nuclear program and Iran's. I mean, Libya's was a joke. They just bought some crates and then shipped them out. Syria was in one place. Iraq was in one place. Iran is dispersed, some would say, in at least 300 different sites. Many of these are in heavily populated area. You're going to bomb Isfahan, one of the great cities in the world, to take out the facilities there. We're going to bomb Natanz, Bushehr. Second of all, these people have the capacity to rebuild. Third, it isn't just a political cost. These guys are on record that they now have over 100,000 missiles surrounding Israel in Hezbollah's hand in Lebanon, in Assad's hand in Syria. And they have made a claim that they can hit Israel from Iran as well, that they have long-term missiles. I have no doubt if Iran is hit by an Israeli, they will respond.
Right. And Israel has its own nuclear deterrent. And Israel's got like 200 weapons or whatever the number actually is. Is Israel confident in its deterrent, or is it nuclear? Is it not nuclear attack that they fear? Is it something else?
Deterrence works against a state that is worried about destruction. If the assumption is, as Netanyahu's assumption has often been, that these guys are messianic, crazy, suicidal.
That Iran is?
That
or
Iran is.
Okay,
that Iran
yeah.
is. Or that they might give this bomb to some other forces. If they might give this bomb to some organization, what would that group do? You can't deter ISIS.
Yeah. So is the fear, Janine, is the fear much more a fear of nuclear weapons material, A, nuclear weapons material going into the wrong hands, or B, more states going nuclear in the region?
No, they're much more worried about just Iran having a nuclear-tipped missile and passing it on to their array of partners who pose the more direct threat to Israel and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and these kinds of things, than they are about, I'd say, the Egyptians or the Saudis starting a nuclear program. But there's a couple reasons why Israel hasn't bombed. One of them is for the reasons we've just said, because it's spread out. A lot of it's underground or in a mountain. Israel's been buying these bunker buster bombs just to have it as an option, but it's a longer flight than it was to Iraq, and that was hard enough. And it's just, there are very few people in the Israeli military who are really pushing this option. Netanyahu likes to flirt with it every once in a while, but put it out there or make it seem like the only option is, the only other option if sanctions fall might be a military option, but it's certainly not the preferred option. Another reason is because it's not that the Israeli nuclear reported 200 missiles is not the real issue here. The problem is in 2006, and I was there for the Lebanon war, Israel's war with Hezbollah, for those of you who remember, you had rockets hitting a third of northern Israel. Hezbollah was firing rockets that were hitting a third of the country had to relocate south to like their aunts and uncles and the beaches and things like that. It was devastating for the Israeli psyche. Okay? And Israel took out a lot of Hezbollah, Iranian-supplied conventional missiles at that time, but they've replenished, and they've got a lot. And no matter what they took out in this Gaza war, there's more coming in. And so you've got this missile threat that really even has very little to do with the nuclear program. In a way, it limits, I don't know if Abbas agrees with me on this, Israel's ability to strike at Iran because they haven't figured out a full answer to the Hezbollah rocket threat. That's at least part of my read on this.
I'm sorry.
No, I absolutely agree. And Iran constantly makes threats to make sure that Israel reads it the way you just read it.
Yeah.
So let's go back, though, to regional struggle with Iran. And we can go back to Yemen, for example. I mean, is that a situation where the Iranians not only support but can help control the insurgents, or do they not have any control, as appears to be the case? Janine, do you have a sense? Yes, the Houthis.
I mean, it seems no doubt that they're giving them all the weaponry. There's some confusion about right, about whether or not they're actually directing command and control of this. But here's the interesting thing.
But can they turn it off and on?
I don't know. Do you know?
You know, if Iran is, as many have alleged, the main source of financial and military help, if you take the pipeline off, Houthis are not going to be as effective as they are.
Yep.
So I think Iran can certainly impact it, but whether they would want to or not, whether it is in their strategic interest to do it or not, is
right.
So
So that's looking at it from the regional context. Just to sort of clarify for our audience here, what is the domestic political context? I mean, my memory is that there was an Arab Spring-like uprising, that Salah, the former leader, was ousted. His successor, who was perhaps even more repressive, he's now ousted. What role is Salah playing in this sort of domestic conflict within Yemen?
Apparently, by all accounts, the deposed ex-president is now part of the Houthi alliance and is working very vigorously against Saudi Arabia and its allies. So you have a very unusual mix of coalitions. But my sense is that it is a very complicated situation to now solve, because you have passed a certain level. There is no center that can control. And in this chaos, forces like Al-Qaeda, forces like the Houthis, forces like Al-Shabaab, forces like ISIS that has just started a new office in Yemen and another office in Afghanistan. They're threatening to open offices in Central Asian states. And you look at the map that they have put out on their website about the future of the Middle East. None of the countries we know are on that map. It is one caliphate ruled by Mr. Baghdadi and his forces. And regardless of who you are, whether you're a Sunni or a Shiite in the Middle East, whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, secular, religious, that prospect has to worry you.
But it feels like we're in the process of watching a series of states in a pivotal part of the world just become unglued, in essence. Is that a fair way to think about it, Janine?
Yeah, I mean, you've got a real, an unusual mix of coalitions, or maybe, I mean, look at what's happening here. You've got the U.S. sitting at the table with Iran negotiating, which by itself, I mean, that in and of itself is like a big deal. That doesn't happen every day, right? And then you've got basically the United States and Iran coordinating airstrikes against ISIS in Syria. So like the U.S. Air Force is like basically the Air Force of Iran right now, there in ISIS. Meanwhile, you've got in Yemen the U.S. partnering with the Saudis to bomb Iran's proxy, the Houthis. Follow? No, I'm not sure they follow this in the White House. This is a really, it's a new thing. It's a lot of it is, and so I've got a theory that the reason the U.S. is helping the Saudis, and this is really, I don't even want to speculate on the radio about this, but is because they want to push back on this notion that the U.S. is abandoning the conventional idea that Iran is the bigger threat. But I think they might be, in a way, Abbas. I mean, they think they're really concerned about ISIS. And you sort of have this weird, unusual situation now where they're kind of, the U.S. is, I don't think, it's very hard to figure out where they're going to come down. They're playing both sides.
It makes sense.
We are playing both sides.
It makes sense that the U.S. is trying to reassure its traditional allies that they haven't forgotten them in the face of...
So that's an easy way to do it with the Saudis. They can say, well, we'll help you with your Yemen thing.
But we've just decided to take the ban off weapons transfers to Egypt.
Well, yeah, that was a showstopper yesterday, Yeah.
So, but if you look at from North Africa to Central Asia, the number of failed states, actual failed states, the number of countries that really don't have a governing state, no center, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Iraq. Iraq is a virtual three-state. I have no doubt the central government of Iraq is a show. You have a Kurdish region, you have a Sunni region dominated by ISIS, and you have the remnants of a Shiite, partly controlled by Iran, partly controlled by Iraqi nationalists, partly controlled by Shiites. The system that the colonial West put in place in this region after the First World War, the Sykes-Picot infamous structure, is collapsing. That is, I think, the real truth. Borders are being redrawn. Kurdish region, the Kurdish question in Syria, the Kurdish question in Turkey, all of this is in a new state of renegotiation. And how it will evolve, only God knows, and He's not talking to us.
So in response... In response to this, he's the only one not talking, right?
Yeah.
In response to this, and in an effort to kind of check Iranian adventurism, we're now hearing about an Arab military force, the possibility of an alliance, a military alliance, and a military force put together by the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and others. What should we make of that?
You know, the strange reality in the Middle East is that if 20 years ago, the countries that have just announced the creation of a 40,000 army, the first country that would have been adamantly opposed to it would be Israel. The idea that Israel is sitting on the sideline and say, yes, go get them, have more troops, is a remarkable change. 40,000 Arab army right around the... But because the landscape is changing and everyone is trying to figure out who in this landscape is their strategic ally, who is their most immediate enemy. Yeah. Remember, she talked about Iran-US negotiating. I was just reading Mr. Zarif and Mr. Kerry, after negotiating for all these days, just spent 4 hours till 2 o'clock in the morning, one-on-one negotiation. There is a guy in Iran called Entezam. He spent 27 years in prison. 27 years in prison because he negotiated with American officials, Brzezinski, in Algeria. And he apparently had the approval of Khomeini. Khomeini reneged. The poor guy spent 27. Zarif now has been having lunch and dinner and breakfast and late night chats for 2 weeks, and nobody bats an eye.
Well, I want to turn to domestic politics in Iran, but first I just wanted to see, Janine, do you have a point of view on how we should be looking at this new military alliance and potential military force? I don't think we have to,
on the list of things we have to worry about right now or think about in terms of the Arab military force. You know, if I'm in Vegas and I'm looking at whether this thing is actually the odds it's going to come together, be funded, actually march on something, be able to work together, you know, that's an easy bet. You know, I'm a bet against. I don't want to be too funny or cynical about it, but you know, we've got this whole thing with Iran. You know, I think one of the reasons that you're seeing all these unusual mix of coalitions, including Israel, perfectly fine with a 40,000, I guess in theory, they probably don't think it's going to take shape either, is because the Iranian negotiations are so limited. It's just the nuclear program. And so we're not really, if we were doing what's called the grand bargain, yep, and really getting to really understand, okay, is it Rouhani's vision of Iran or is it Khamenei's? And what are you guys really about? And we really talked honestly, and we resolved other things like support for terror, and you guys are going to stop saying that thing about how you're going to wipe Israel off the map, and then, you know, we're going to have trade again. The fact that it's just the nuclear program amid this history of deception, I think, is one of the things that's making it hard to figure out these alliances and why the Sunni Shia thing is smoldering and growing. It's I don't know if anybody has.
But one could argue that it would make it just impossibly complex, both politically but also just in terms of the negotiations more broadly, if it went beyond nuclear materials and technology. Then you really get into the hard issues. Let me take you though back to attitudes within Iran and amongst the elite in Iran. Here you've got Zarif, who was educated at San Francisco State, for heaven's sakes, but also at University of Denver. Our energy secretary's counterpart, Ernie Moniz' counterpart, also Western educated. Rouhani himself, went to University in Glasgow in Scotland, and at the same time, the supreme leader has never left Iran. Do we put so much stock into how that really affects their attitudes, their worldview, and their attitudes towards the specifics of today?
Well, first of all, the supreme leader has left Iran, but he's gone to North Korea.
Yes, I'm sorry.
And apparently returned very impressed with what he saw in North Korea.
Yes.
Really, I heard it from a very
that.
reliable
Oh
source that said, this is the way to run a country.
Are you joking, Abbas?
No, I'm not. I'm not joking. But he has never gone to the West.
Yep.
But he is, by all accounts, a voracious reader. What he reads is a matter of state secret. Iran, I don't think the Iranian elite speaks with one voice. I think the notion that there is one voice that shapes everything, or even the notion that Khamenei determines everything, to me is a little bit of an exaggeration. He is more powerful than any other person, but he doesn't have absolute power. Khamenei has been trying for 10 years to get rid of his chief rival, Rafsanjani. They have gone at Rafsanjani with everything they had. They put his son in prison. They put his daughter in prison. They accused him of all matters of financial corruption, much of which might be incidentally correct. But they've gone at him, but he's still there. He's still a very powerful person. Ahmadinejad, handpicked by Khamenei, challenged him in some very serious ways. So there are different voices in Iran. The Iranian population has clearly, unmistakably spoken against the policies of Mr. Khamenei. Khamenei's candidate in the last election had about 7-8 million votes. Rouhani, that clearly distanced himself from everything Khamenei had said, got 19 million votes. So the voice of the people, in my view, is clear for a reconciliation, for an end to this kind of silly shenanigans that the radicals wanted to engage in.
So this audience member asks if there is a split and how wide that split is between the Iranian clerics and those doing the negotiations and the secular leaders.
I think there is a very big split. I think the only thing that in the clergy that they have agreed, that Khamenei and Rouhani and Rafsanjani have agreed, is that we'll make some concessions. They don't have a consensus on how many concessions they can make to end the sanctions. They want the sanctions ended because the sanctions are hurting. The Iranian economy is in a very, very dire situation. The horizon looks even bleaker with oil around 55%, Iran's share of the oil market having fallen. So they want the sanctions ended, but beyond that, I don't think there is a consensus in the elite. There is serious, in my view at least, factional feud, and there is a big gap between what the people want and what the regime in its entirety wants. The Iranian people want, in my view, something very different than what they have now.
So this questioner asks about the lifting of sanctions and perhaps the possibility of a much improved economy, even prosperity. In your view, do you see the Iranian government in a position to reap the benefits of this on behalf of the Iranian people, to really turn around that economy, and at what kind of pace can you imagine that happening?
If you look at the way the Iranian economy is, the most obvious beneficiaries of a loosening of the sanctions will be the Revolutionary Guards, will be the same corrupt people who have run the economy and who control probably 70% of the Iranian economy. They control the levers of power. They're the first ones who are going to grab everything that comes their way. So it's going to strengthen the bad guys in the short term, I have no doubt. But anytime you loosen the system, anytime you open it, anytime you allow some more economic activity, the good guys eventually, in my view, win. So in the short term, I think they're right. An opening of the sanctions will strengthen the IRGC, they'll strengthen the conservatives who have a chokehold on the economy.
Hope is a funny thing, and several of the question cards ask in essence, what would it take for there to be an Arab Spring in Iran? Not the green, not the one that failed, but in the face of the possibility of a better life, right? Would that perhaps embolden those, whet the appetite for change?
One of the people who wrote something about what I had read, the Stanford magazine wrote something about me, and they talked to this guy who was my critic. He said, "I'm a lunatic optimist." So I'm a lunatic optimist. I have to let me begin by saying that. But my sense is that truly what is happening in Iran and what is not getting much attention, and I've written this in a couple of places. It will come out, hopefully in this week, in fact. One of them will come out in the Atlantic. There's a new kind of politics in Iran. People are avoiding challenging the regime frontally. They're chipping away at it at the societal level. They're chipping it. Look at women. This regime tried to do with Iranian women what the Taliban did to women in Afghanistan. Now 60-odd% of Iranian women, college students, are women. There are more Iranian poets, filmmakers, writers, entrepreneurs, professors than ever. Music is banned in Iran. There is more music in Iran than ever. Solo singing by women is banned in Iran. One of the most popular songs right now in Iran is a solo performance by a woman of a song praising Zoroastrian values. If that should not give the leadership tormenting dreams at night, I don't know what will.
So, Janine, one of the question cards, one of the questioners is asking, in essence, with shale gas, with our being even more clearly energy independent, how does that change our level of interest in the region? Is there a point at which this is not a front burner set of issues for us? Or are there other reasons, unrelated to oil, that keep us deeply engaged and will always keep us deeply engaged?
Well, certainly it's going to help if we all woke up one day and we all were powered with solar and renewables and or shale, and we didn't need to import from the region. But I still think that there's going to be reasons that we are going to be drawn into conflicts there and protecting our allies, not only Israel. I mean, look what's happening right now. We're protecting the Saudis. We're helping the Saudis in a way. It doesn't really have much to do with oil, this war that's going on there. Protecting King Abdullah in Jordan. And we've got this real problem right now of radical Islam spreading across the region, destabilizing, forming a caliphate, regardless of whether we cut our energy dependence on the region.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And clearly, we can't completely separate ourselves from the consequences of that. And
no,
I think 9/11 showed us that. Yeah. So other questioners ask about it's basically back to this sort of states becoming unglued, wanting to understand, in essence, the power of ISIS. And have we overestimated? Have we underestimated it? Do we even understand it as a government now? In terms of our U.S. response. Janine, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I don't have thoughts on. I don't know specifically because I don't. I'm not privy to any intelligence on this. But I feel like that we, at the White House, was obviously taken by surprise a bit by how quickly they came on the scene, and we do seem to be formulating our policy a bit in an ad hoc way. I'm not sure, but also, on the other hand, it's like, people always focus on what the United States is doing or isn't doing, and there are certain things that we just can't. President Obama can't fix ISIS. Right? It's not going to be able to solve this problem. And another one of these unusual mixes of coalitions, ISIS was funded by the Saudi, they came about as part of the Syrian revolution. They were funded by the people we're now partnering with together against another, it's just crazy. So, and we haven't really been able to call the Saudis out on their support for certain radical Sunni groups. And that's been, I think, part of the problem as well. So, I think, in terms of ISIS, I don't know how much we really know. I mean, look we can't have one journalist. One journalist can't really, Vice got in there somehow. Vice News was able to do a documentary. But we don't have any even like open source reporting on there. So I'm assuming there's some better covert reporting going on. But I think we're sort of learning on the fly here, unfortunately.
But remember, they control a territory larger than England, a population larger than Denmark, and they've done it now for over a year and a half, in spite of constant bombing by a lot of forces. It isn't a joke. It isn't going away. They're more brutal than anybody has imagined. They're more organized than anyone has imagined. They have longer-term plans. Go on the website and read their journal. They publish a journal in multi-languages. You don't need intelligence report. You want to find out what they do, go read Dabeq, D-A-B-E-Q, online. They publish it in English. It has more production quality than 90% of websites you see for pay.
Or if you don't want to go on Dabeq, just go on Twitter. No, they put out 40,000 tweets when they were storming Mosul last year. I mean, they were
in 28 languages.
They're very adept with social media. So,
and so for us, I mean, if you think about U.S. government position, we were, you know, focused enormously on getting, you know, sort of toppling the regime in Syria, getting Assad out of office. Now, isn't the effort to halt ISIS a far higher priority to the U.S. government?
Well, if you look at Syria, ISIS came out of the chaos after Assad went after the people and began to shoot them, began to shoot peaceful demonstrations. If the Obama administration had earlier drawn a line in the sand and said, no, you can't use heavy machine guns against your own people, as many people suggested that they should do, you might not have the chaos out of which a phenomenon like ISIS grows. Now it has grown and it's become this phenomenon. ISIS grew where? It grew in Syria and it grew in Iraq. People had been telling the international community, that they had been telling the U.S. that Maliki is tearing apart Iraq.
The former leader of Iraq.
The former prime minister. Maliki's sectarianism, Maliki's pro-Shiite, pro-Iran policies is tearing asunder Iraq. The U.S. didn't do anything. Nobody did anything till they came with 1,000 people and took over the city of Mosul with the help of Sunnis, with the help of Baathists. Those forces were there. They were disgruntled by Maliki. No one did anything about Maliki. And you get this phenomenon. Now everybody says, Obama, go fix it. No, as you say, he can't fix it. It's something that is...
So Janine, as you know, Vice President Biden, before he was vice president, when he was a senator, took the position that we should, in fact, go with the idea of Iraq breaking up into 3 separate states, a Shia state, a Sunni state, a Kurdish state. Is that now de facto what we have, and what should our policy be?
I think Abbas mentioned that it is really what we kind of have, right? But I don't think that I don't think we're going to, even with everything that's going on right now, I just don't see the president spending time on this Iraq. How are we going to put back together Iraq? I mean, look, what the region is in such turmoil right now. We can't get a handle on it. And when it comes to Assad, we reversed. We just call it what it is. We reversed. A greater threat emerged. We said he had to go originally after he gassed his people. Now we're not saying. Now Kerry said 2 days ago, we have to talk to Assad. We're going to have to work out a deal with him. Yep. So I think a certain pragmatism is reigning right now, with no clear end. And this is going to go on. Syria's going to go on. There's no end in sight on Syria. I mean, the diplomacy hasn't worked. And what's been interesting also with the Israelis on this is they've been very quiet on the whole Syria front. But I still worry that it's a tinderbox there along the Golan Heights in Lebanon. You've had some issues, and there are people leaking different things. One day, some people say, you know, we got to keep Assad, and other people say, no, we need to get rid of him because he is the manifestation of Iran, which is their real greatest threat. He is backed by Iran, so you would think that actually the Israelis would say, we can handle these ISIS guys. This is an opportunity to get rid of Assad. But they're not saying that. And early on in 2011, when I was talking to a northern commander there, when it was just starting, he was very clear that they prefer the devil they know to the devil they didn't know. And my feeling now from talking to people in Israel is that that is still the bottom line.
Right. Right.
So,
and we prefer dealing with a state and a leader than a network that is even more brutal than that particular leader. Was there a time in the very beginning of the uprising in Syria? Was there a time when there were not foreign fighters playing a key role, when you could sort of separate the wheat from the chaff? You knew where you had a legitimate domestic upheaval. Was there a time when we could have intervened? Or did that time never exist?
Go ahead.
no, I mean, look, there's an argument about this. There is. I mean, there are people who strongly believe this point of view in Washington. Who said
That
if we
there
had
was a
just, I mean,
time.
Abbas sort of articulated it just now, right? You said if we had gone in at that time. But the U.S., they were having a hard time. Our intelligence guys were having a hard time figuring out who to give those night vision goggles to, or whatever our light, what did we say we were going to give, light armament. I mean, they were literally going and saying, well, we get, and then the heavier weaponry, like the RPGs, like we're going to give it to this guy, and then his brother's going to take it, and they're going to, they don't know. We don't have anybody on the ground to really sort it out. So I don't think it was as easy as many people assumed it could have been at that moment. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have tried. And that we should have forced Assad out sooner. But look what happened. It was in the context of Egypt. We had just forced Mubarak out, and we were like, what did we do? What did we do?
But
We got the
there
Muslim
was-
Brotherhood, So they remember the context.
There was a
Yeah.
proposal early on that when Assad began to use planes and helicopters to shoot at people, there was a proposal. Hillary has written about it in her memoir, that the U.S., with the help of Turkey, with potential help from NATO, with financial underwriting by Saudis, declare a no-fly zone and say
Yes.
you can't use your
That's
planes.
a good reminder.
That,
They
to
could have
me,
done that.
was the point where they should have done it. If they had done it, then all of this killing, these massive murders by Assad would not have happened. And absent that massive murder of civilians, we don't know whether ISIS would have been the kind of cancerous growth that it became.
Yeah, yeah. So back to where we began, talking about our relationship with our closest allies there. I think we've explored the relationship with the Saudis and others, and with Jordan. You've helped us out there, Janine. What an unusual time to be having a fight with the Israelis, given the turmoil. Where do you think, Janine, from the perspective of a Netanyahu government, where are the interests beyond the let's keep the Iranians in check? But, the Iranians are not the whole problem, right? ISIS would exist without the Iranians. There are impending dangers throughout the region and globally. How would you describe the way they see their interests?
The Israelis, how they see their interests?
The Israeli government and how it sees it.
If you're looking at the security picture, we've kind of touched on it already, but they're looking at Gaza and they see Hamas still in power there, rearming after last summer's war. They're happy with Egypt, happy, very happy after yesterday's announcement that they're going to get their arms shipments released, very happy with Sisi. Jordan, worried. This is my imaginary map of the Middle East where I'm going around in a circle. In Jordan, they're worried about King Abdullah. They want him to hold on, be strong, and want to make sure the U.S. is reinforcing him. But one of the arguments for why Netanyahu says he can't do a peace deal now is because he's worried about the weakness of Jordan. Syria, right on their border, in flames, watching that cautiously, but surprisingly, at least overtly, calm about the whole thing. Feel like they can handle this, at least for now. And, and before on the eve of the Arab Spring, when the whole thing started, it was, Lebanon they were concerned about. Hezbollah had just come to power. And that was the big story on the eve of the Arab Spring in January 2011. I remember because I was in Beirut at that time. But it was, and so they're looking at all this. And then they look further afield at, the chaos in these other countries. And it's obviously a worrisome picture. And that's something that the U.S., you're right, the U.S. and Israel should be. And don't worry. I mean, security cooperation between U.S. and Israel is still happening. And what's ironic is, after Israel bombed the Iraqi reactor in '81, the U.S. suspended an F-16 shipment that had been approved. That's how they responded, and condemned them in the UN Security Council. That was a real move. What has the U.S. done, really? We talked a lot about the fighting and the kids in the playground. Everybody's bickering with each other. But what have they done really? The president came out and said, I'm going to have to reevaluate my point of view on the peace process, how I'm going to handle the peace process. And everybody thinks it's a cataclysm. I'm started playing devil's advocate. I do think there's an enormous strain on U.S.-Israel relations, but in terms of the actual impact, we haven't really seen much yet. They still have the security cooperation, the money's still flowing, everything's still happening. It's a little subtler than that.
Let me just pick up on what you said about Jordan, because one of the question cards asked about Jordan and about its stability and King Abdullah's holding power, staying power. One of the stresses on Jordan, of course, are the refugee flows, both the Palestinian refugees that they've been home to for a very long time now, but the Syrian refugees now on top of that. Talk a little bit about the impact, obviously it's a real strain on the economy. To what degree is it a strain on the economy? I shouldn't have answered that question. I should have asked it. But also, what are the political stresses and strains as a result?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Well, no. I mean, the Jordanians are really worried. I don't know if we're it doesn't look like we're helping them enough on this front. I mean, they've got how many Syrians are more 100,000, 200,000? I mean,
yeah, I think it's
more.
Actually, I've got it.
400,000. I mean, a whole country has been displaced by this war.
It's 1.2 million.
1.2 million now. I mean, there are 100,000 here in this country. Everybody's gone everywhere, and we've let in, I think, like 2,000 Syrian refugees or something.
I think it's very few. About 600.
600? Yeah, I thought I read 2,000. So in other words, we're willing to absorb refugees right now here. So we just have to keep propping them up. We have to give them money and air support. Look what happened to that poor Jordanian pilot. Yeah. I mean, they're trying, and they don't have, the mightiest ability to deal with this on their own. We have to help them.
In terms of his role, though, does King Abdullah have a certain legitimacy in that he's, a direct descendant of Muhammad, and he's not just a recent monarch?
Well, the monarchies are faring better right across the region still. That was the early prediction, right, Abbas? I mean, the monarchies are holding on. The Saudis, the Jordanians, Morocco. They're holding on, whereas it's the republics that are having trouble. So. He's not in a dicey position, and he's facing certainly some resistance from some of his detractors internally, but he's still in command for now.
Yeah, yeah.
So the monarchies that have survived have had the grace of Saudi money or the Emirate money or Kuwaiti money behind them. In the case of Morocco, it has survived because it has also benefited from the largesse of these countries. And it has an economic viable base itself, Morocco does. But Jordan is really a much more, I think, vulnerable state in terms of both the composition of the population, the way it was drafted. I mean, you could say that because he's a descendant of the Prophet, he has legitimacy, but everyone knows that the reason there is a Jordan is because Western powers had promised certain people some kingdoms, and his grandfather was left without a throne, and they carved out Jordan to give him a throne that essentially Lawrence had promised. So in the eyes of the people, he has legitimacy because he has held the country together. His father held the country together. But people also know where these regimes have come from.
Yeah. So I have a final question from the audience, and that relates to the Palestinian Authority. We've been talking about states becoming unglued, but there's enormous pressure on the Palestinian Authority. I mean, in some ways, they've been kind of undermined by Israel. They themselves walked away from any kind of framework agreement when the U.S. presented it to them. Can you imagine the Palestinian Authority imploding, and what would that mean?
Well, in one sense, they have imploded. You now have two Palestinian authorities. You have Hamas, which is running its own country, essentially, and you have a Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which survives by very, very meager means that it's given. I think it is a very precarious position, and in some way it has imploded. But my view is that, again, part of what got us to this position is, unfortunately, the intransigence of the Israelis, but also the incompetence of the Palestinian Authority leadership, the corruption of the Palestinian Leadership Authority, the billions of dollars that were given in grants and were siphoned off to private accounts, created the atmosphere for a phenomenon like Hamas to grow. If all of the money that had gone to the Palestinian Authority after the accords were signed, the Spanish accords were signed, or after the U.S. Had them agree, if all of that money had gone to the building of an infrastructure, building of a viable economy in both sides of this state, would we have seen the rise of Hamas? Phenomena like Hamas grow out of the incompetence and corruption of the status quo.
But let's look forward, because Abu Mazen has been our great hope in all this. Is he strong? Can you imagine him being weakened further? And what does that mean for Israel if the Palestinian Authority has no authority?
Well, they just joined the International Criminal Court today, and what that what's going to happen is I'm betting again. It's hard to prognosticate on this stuff, but here's what I'm betting on. It's an easy bet. No peace process for the next, at least till 2017. When's the next president come in? 2017, right? Obama's not picking this up. There's no reason to. Maybe he'll go to the UN Security Council with some declaration of principles, two-state solution based on the all that. But I don't see any serious negotiations going on. And what you'll see in light of that is more unilateral moves by the Palestinians to win de facto recognition as a state around the world. And they'll start operating like a state, at least in the West Bank. I'm talking about West Bank, Fatah, Abbas, Palestine. They don't seem to be able to reconcile with Hamas. And when they do that, it makes it even harder for the Israelis to work with them. So I don't worry as much about a Palestinian revolution against Abbas as I do about him simply just passing from the scene. He hasn't been in good health. And I don't see a moderate successor to him that the Israelis would be able to work with. But meanwhile, he's still been demonized by Netanyahu as someone he can't work with. So I'm not optimistic on that front, unfortunately.
Yeah. And Abbas, I don't think you're about to cheer us up either on this subject.
No, as a lunatic optimist, I have to say something cheerful.
Well, if you could think of something, say it now.
It's a full moon out. It's a wonderful moon. Let's watch the moon.
So please join me in thanking Janine Zakaria and Abbas Malani.